Hello, friends. It's good to welcome everyone here to our discussion of what it means to confront the role of white complicity in racial injustice in our country. My name is Rob Saylor, and I teach religion and culture here at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. This event is motivated by two impulses: reckoning and celebration. Reckoning because, as we know, to expect only people of color to do the hard and painful work of addressing white supremacy, or as we'll discuss, white pseudosupremacy, and racial inequities in our country, to put that work only on people of color would be, in fact, to perpetuate and further the very dynamics of racial injustice that we're talking about. Those of us who identify as white need to have an honest reckoning about how even the best intentioned among us are caught up in unjust, what we might even call sinful, dynamics of racial oppression and inequity. So one of the reasons why we are here is reckoning. The other impulse is celebration. We here at Christian Theological Seminary celebrate that our students, including the three that have gathered with us today, are and have been out in the world, in our communities, calling the nation and the Christian church to exactly this sort of reckoning. And they've been doing it in powerful, creative ways. CTS as a seminary certainly can't take all the credit for how these preachers and activists have been formed and shaped for this work. But at the seminary, we can certainly say that their presence among us enriches our learning community and continually presses us towards a deeper realization of our core values of working alongside God's Spirit for the healing of the world. In particular, today we celebrate the publication of Kerry Connelly's recent book, which is entitled Good White Racist: Confronting Your Role in Racial Injustice, published in 2020 by Westminster John Knox Press. Kerry will be speaking to us about the book in just a few minutes. She's a writer, a certified life coach, author of the no-nonsense blog Jersey Girl Jesus, and host of the podcast White on White, which reimagines white identity apart from pseudo-supremacy. She's currently completing an MDiv at CTS, and she lives in New Jersey with her family. We're also joined today by two other students completing their studies at CTS. Cassidy Hall is an author, documentary filmmaker, co-host of the podcast Encountering Silence, and holds an MA in counseling. Her work focuses on the intersection of contemplation and social justice. Her films include the feature-length In Pursuit of Silence, and more recently a short documentary film about the Trappist monk Thomas Merton. She's a teaching assistant at CTS, where she's studying for her MDiv and MTS degrees, Master of Theological Studies. She also serves as a student pastor of First Congregational United Church of Christ, where she's begun the ordination process. Since 2017, Cassidy served as the secretary of the International Thomas Merton Society, and most recently she was added to the board of Enfleshed, an organization which creates spiritual resources focused on collective liberation. We're also joined by Mason Mennenga, who's a theologian and podcaster. He's the host of a podcast, A People's Theology, with inspiration from process theology, radical theology, liberation theology, and many more. Mason hopes to explore and share in A People's Theology the inspiring and liberating theologies that will transform the world. He's also the podcast host of the Black Sheep podcast, presented by HM Magazine. In that podcast, he and his co-host Cullen interview musicians, artists, and other creatives about their art, life, faith, and much more. We're deeply gratified to be joined by a panel of such creative, exciting thinkers and activists. So, Kerry, I'd like to begin with you. I wonder if you could share with us what led you to write your book and what sort of conversations you hope it will prompt among Christians in particular.
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much for hosting this conversation, and to CTS for allowing this conversation to happen. It's such an important one, and I'm deeply humbled and appreciative, and so excited that I get to do this with Mason and Cassidy, who are two of my favorite people in the world. So I started writing about social justice in general, specifically racial justice, on my blog, Jersey Girl Jesus, quite some time ago. And I was really, I guess I was really naive, because I was shocked by the visceral, mean-spirited feedback that I would get, primarily, quite frankly, from straight white Christian men. And because I'm an Enneagram 8, I of course needed to poke that beast a little bit more. So I just kept writing. And what I realized then was that I really needed to do the research. I really needed to start understanding the way systemic racism works in our country and in our culture. And so that was really, I'd have to say that was honestly probably the beginning of my own racial awakening. And then I came to CTS, where I was exposed to womanist and Black liberation theologies, and definitely so much in my worldview changed as a result of being exposed to those theologies. And in Mason, was it our second semester, I think, we were assigned to watch an episode of On Being with Ruby Sales, where Krista Tippett interviewed Ruby Sales. And if you don't know who Ruby Sales is, she is a womanist, public theologian, and an activist. And she was, when she was 17, she was at a civil rights rally, and she was standing on the front porch of a general store. And a white man approached her with a shotgun and pulled the trigger. And a young white seminarian jumped in front of her, took that bullet, and died instantly, saving her life. And her life was obviously forever changed. And in that episode of On Being, she said something that I could not get out of my head. And I know Mason and I sat and talked about it in the CTS cafeteria so many times. She said, I understand that we have a Black liberating theology, but what I want to know is, where is the white liberating theology? Where is the theology that liberates white people from pain and hunger and addiction? And that's such a womanist thing to say, right? And I was so struck by the sheer generosity of it. I had to go back and listen to that interview so many times, over and over and over. And I started to realize, well, yeah, what would a white liberation theology actually look like? What would that mean? And as I thought about it, I began to realize that we have, as white people, we have essentially suffered a failure of imagination. We have lacked the imagination to lean into a vision for what we could be apart from the construct of pseudosupremacy. And until we know what we want to become, we're never going to release our grasp on this false sense of dominance, right? So we need to start doing that collective work of imagining. And so that's where I kind of started to start thinking about what that would be like and how that would happen. And then a few semesters after that, I actually, in another class that for CTS that I took in New York City, I was actually able to meet Ruby Sales. Thank you, Ann Garner, because our fellow student who forced me to go talk to her because I was too scared. But I actually literally sat at her feet, and she took my hand in hers and held it in her lap and stared into my eyes. And she's got a fierce stare, let me tell you. And she said, white supremacy is killing the souls of white people. She said, it is flattening and homogenizing you, and it is stealing the legacy of your ancestries, and white supremacy is soul murder. And again, I was so struck by that. I was so struck, and I realized that this is a matter of deep pastoral concern, right? This is a matter of a soul disfigurement in white people that needs healing, and it needs it requires reparations and repentance. And so that's why I started really wanting to lean into what this white liberating theology would be that could liberate us from this soul murder. And as I started to think about that, I started to realize, well, hold up a minute. I really need to start understanding what is white identity as it is, right? What is the capital white identity? Not what does it mean to be a white person, but what does it mean to be part of whiteness? And that's when I started to realize that for so many of us, it is a paradox, this paradox of what does it mean to be a good white racist, you know? And since the book has come out, I can honestly say that I've been encouraged by the work that I have seen many white people doing. I've dropped in on lots of Zoom book clubs, and I've counseled and coached some church pastors and leaders and teams. And that has been really, it's been difficult, but it's also been really encouraging, because what I'm seeing happening is pastors and leaders are finally willing to go where I think we need to go, which is, and this is my hope for the church, is that the church really needs to engage in a deep lament and a deep grief. And we need to be willing to enter into that space. And no leader, especially in this world where so many pastors, this world of skinny jean, shiny tooth pastors who sound more like self-help gurus than they do actual preachers of the word, I think that no leader wakes up in the morning and says, hey, I would love to lead my people into a place of deep grief and lament. But I think that that's actually where we need to go. We need to go there so that we can move through that and into a place of true repentance and into this new collective identity, this new identity of whiteness. So that's my hope for the church.
Fantastic. Looking forward to hearing much more about that. But I'd like to turn to you, Cassidy, and wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your work and how you see it interacting with some of these topics that Kerry's raising.
Yeah, so first of all, it's great to be with you guys. And I'm so grateful for the work that Kerry does and that Mason does, and the importance of us coming together to experience white people having conversations with white people, because as we all know, the problem of racism is a white problem. So in confronting my own role in racial injustice, I want to share a story kind of as a framework for looking at complacency, complicity, and our need for confrontation, right? Which is a part of the title of this talk. Because in my experience, this all begins with stepping out of our comfort. So last year at the Mixed Methods Preaching Conference put on by the PhD program in African American Preaching and Sacred Rhetoric here at CTS, I had the important experience of not only being a minority in the classroom, but also a minority in the conference at large. And on the second or third day or so, when Reverend Dr. Teresa Fry Brown was kicking off the morning, we gathered at circle tables with our coffee and morning snacks to listen. So I did just that. Got my coffee, grabbed some fruit, probably a pastry, but who knows, and sat down at one of the 15 tables or so. But here's the thing. I sat at the white table. I sat with all white people. I had the experience before me when I had the chance to encounter being a minority, and I still sat at the white table. Honestly, sure, my body filled with shame. I got flustered. I looked around. I wondered what I was doing there and why and how my white body would do that, why I would move there out of comfort. And I'm not foolish enough to think that it was only because I had friends there. And in that moment, in recognizing the need for me to be more uncomfortable and the opportunities I had to step into discomfort and growth, I dragged my ass up out of that chair and asked if I could sit with the Black women at the table nearby who warmly welcomed me. But this story sticks with me and is important because I can remember what my body felt like at the all-white table. And I can remember the discomfort I felt in moving tables. I remember the discomfort of asking if I could sit at their table and the awkwardness, right? And I know that discomfort, that awkwardness, is just the beginning of the feeling I need to be willing to step into every single day. Because justice work, this work, is daily work that demands our white discomfort. And no, moving tables at a conference is not an act of justice. But what it was an experience for my white body to understand the ways I cling to comfort. Because this is all a part of white complicity. White complicity is this clinging to comfort because it is also a clinging to the status quo, which is another reason I'm here. This conversation itself, right, isn't necessarily comfortable for me or any of us. I am an anxious person. I worry about saying or writing the wrong things. I worry about showing up in the wrong ways. But I also know sometimes our absences can be another form of complicity. And so in confronting my own role in racial injustice, I think about the false narratives of white pseudo-supremacy culture, which hopefully Kerry will unpack that more for us later. And these false narratives tell us that our bodies will be protected and comforted if we remain silent on issues that matter. They're false narratives that coddle us as white people. And as we all know, false narratives which are built upon countless systems of oppression. And so many of us, white people, choose to stay comfortable by being nice white people, by being, as Kerry's book says, good white racists, but not rocking the boat, not disrupting the status quo, because that status quo protects us. So what I'm learning is that this work requires a daily moment-to-moment confrontation of myself and of each other, right? This conversation too, a confrontation of my complicity on issues of injustice. And that confrontation, right, is about my complicity, and that's about my direct participation. And that is what makes me racist. That is what creates the need for daily anti-racist living, which is interpersonal, collective, and systemic work. This complicity that we all participate in, knowingly or unknowingly as white people, fails our Black siblings, fails ourselves, and fails beloved community. And I think right now, one of the most significant ways we're failing beloved community as white people is our failure to go deep. Some of us are using Black Lives Matter as another form of tokenism, a performative platform, a facade, which lacks the depth for true change. And until we're willing to truly step in that daily and moment-to-moment discomfort, this will exist. And we were warned by countless people. I mean, you can look back at Martin Luther King Jr., you can look at Bell Hooks, Malcolm X. So many important people wrote about the white liberal, right? And so in particular, I'm thinking about over 50 years ago, Malcolm X talked about the white liberal and how the white liberal would use the Black struggle as a political pawn through tokenism, empty promises, and lies. He even said that the white liberal is the worst enemy of America and of Black people. And so I'm here, showing up uncomfortable and doing my best to be true to the work of justice that exists in our whole being, right? Our body, our heart, our mind, our soul, and not just our words.
Thank you, Cassidy. It's a very powerful testimony. And turning to you, Mason, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about your work and how you see this conversation and these themes playing out in your context.
Mm-hmm. Well, I first off want to say thank you, Rob, for having me, and thank you, Cassidy and Kerry, such good friends, and to be able to have this conversation with all of you is just an honor. So I just want to start with that. The other thing I want to mention, first off, is that I think pseudo-white supremacy is not a Black, Indigenous, and people of color problem. It is a problem of white people. It is by white people and is caused by white people. And therefore, I think our role as white people then is to address white supremacy. This is not to be the burden of Black, Indigenous, and people of color to address. This is the responsibility of white people to address. And so we've already mentioned a few things about confronting as white people pseudo-white supremacy. And I think one of the ways in which we need to do that, and one of the things that I really care deeply about, is how white people then have that responsibility. What sort of responsibilities do we have in confronting pseudo-white supremacy? So Kerry mentioned Ruby Sales and the white seminarian who jumped in front of a bullet. I think we ought to get to the point where our responsibility takes us to that risk. Now, I don't hope that for everyone, but I want us to get to a place where, as a white person, we're willing to do that for the other. And so my particular work is sort of to think about that kind of responsibility through a theological lens. And so one of the things that you mentioned at the beginning was part of my work really cares deeply about process theology. And so I really care a lot about how not implicit, but how inherent and innate creativity and relationality is to God and the world. And so if we are to be creative beings and that God is also a creative being, we need to be thinking about creative ways in which white people take on the responsibility of confronting pseudo-white supremacy. I'm talking with podcasters here. I'm talking with a filmmaker. I'm talking with writers. They're thinking, both Kerry and Cassidy, and I hopefully myself, are thinking of ways in which we can creatively and holistically address white responsibility and white supremacy. In addition to that, I think that obviously we are also relational beings, and that my relationships with Black, Indigenous, and people of color is thwarted by my inherited and implied white supremacy that exists within me. And so my relationships, because they're thwarted, I myself need to have a certain responsibility in order to liberate those relationships, and in order to transform those relationships into the ways in which God intends and desires. And so I think about white supremacy in sort of the ways in which we address it need to be both creative and highly relational. In addition to that, I just want to mention to kind of my own history into this kind of conversation. I grew up in South Dakota, where I don't know the exact statistics, but I would say at least 95% of the people I grew up with were white. I never had to think about racism and white supremacy. It was the water in which I swam, and because of that, you never even had to think about it twice, because it's what you breathed. And so moving from that context into a context where I now live in the Twin Cities, I've really had to be kind of thrusted into that conversation in ways in which I would have never intended or even would have guessed years before. And it really came to a head this summer at the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent protests. I started to really I was already in those kind of conversations prior, but it really all came to the head when I saw Derek Chauvin standing and killing another Black man in our city. Not too far from where I had lived a couple years ago even. I knew Cup Foods. I had been there many times before. I knew that this place that existed sort of just in this ordinary reality for me had now become the epicenter of a worldwide movement. And my white complicity in all of that had just made that kind of an ordinary place. And it wasn't until somebody was literally murdered that I started to realize how even such an ordinary place like Cup Foods could become an epicenter for a worldwide movement of racial justice. And in addition to all of that, I mentioned before with the height of responsibility that white people need to have to the point where they're willing to take a bullet. I started to see ways in which that was manifested in the protests. I started seeing white protesters stepping in between police and Black activists, willing to take those rubber bullets, willing to take that tear gas. And that's the kind of level of responsibility and action that white people need to participate in. If we are to have both creative and relational ways in which we address pseudo-white supremacy. And so my work does that through podcasting and writing and certainly through a theological lens. But there are lots of other ways in which our bodies can manifest this addressing and confronting of white pseudo-supremacy. And a lot of times that can be through not only just speaking out, but also putting your body on the line. And I think a lot of us are not willing to do that. And there's a lot of context involved in making a decision like that. But that's something that we must be willing to do, because that's the imperative nature of this reality of white pseudo-supremacy. So that's kind of all of my work and my history within, and my own personal story within this conversation.
Thank you, Mason. And we've had a question in the chat. All three of you, we hear being very intentional about this language of white pseudo-supremacy. And Kerry, I think that was a term that you introduced and that you've been very intentional about. Could you say a little bit more about what's at stake in naming the pseudo in pseudo-supremacy?
Yeah, definitely. Whiteness as a construct is designed to be invisible to white people, right? It's not invisible to everybody else, but it's invisible to us. And one of the ways that we can, it's reinforced is through language. And there are so many paradigms in which it's reinforced, but language is definitely one of them. And so my belief is that we can either just remain complicit and allow our language to continue to oppress people, or we can resist that by pointing out, right, and pointing to where supremacy is, or the ideology of supremacy is at play. And so every time that we say white supremacy, we are reinforcing this idea that whiteness is somehow supreme, which we know it's not, right? We know it's a social construct. It has teeth and claws and it does harm, but it's also something that was constructed by white people. So in order to really identify it as a false construct, I feel it's important to continuously place that pseudo in front of the supremacy part, so that we're saying this is not a real thing. White people are not actually supreme. This is an idea that we are trying to dismantle. So that's why I try to be very intentional about using it that way.
Excellent. And then I'd like to pick up on a dimension that I think all three of you mentioned, because all three of you in your work and in your vocations, you balance on the one hand movements of protest and sort of collective action, but also this artistic piece. And all three of you have talked about imagination and so on. I wonder if any of the three of you or all three of you could say more about how those two moments fit together. That is the moment of action and the moment of creativity and imagination.
Oh, for me, I personally think that that's, as I said earlier, that's where our failure has been, right? And now that we are aware, everybody who's listening today, we are aware that we have failed, now we can push into it. I also think it's important because that's the place where we get tired. That's the place where it gets hard, because we're trying to imagine something that doesn't exist yet, right? Something new. And that's where it is, as Cassidy brilliantly said earlier, it's so much easier to just stay comfortable rather than to do the hard work. So, and language is a perfect example of that. I was having a long conversation with somebody the other day around the idea, which comes from the Bible, of the paradigm of darkness and light, and how darkness is always equivalent to evil, which I think is just bad theology in general, but that's a whole other webinar. But I think that there is a real that we consistently reinforce the idea every time we equate darkness with evil, and that's reinforcing white pseudosupremacy, and we need to resist that and not hold that so dear, that language so dear, over the harm that it's doing to human beings. But that takes imagination. It takes imagination to think of a new way to express that idea without reinforcing pseudosupremacy.
Excellent.
I think in addition to that, both the action piece and sort of that creative piece, to me, are not necessarily, one is doing this more abstract thinking, and the other one is doing this more concrete activity. I think they're really well integrated, and the reason why I think they're both really well integrated is the action piece is an incredibly embodied activity, as well as any form of creativity, both of which will always be embodied. And so and the reason why I think it's important for white people to do these embodied activities, like whether it's out in a protest or doing something creative, is because innate in pseudo-white supremacy is disembodiment. White supremacy is attempting to disembody white people from their own bodies. And so in order to do, whether it's the action piece or the creative piece, both of which completely embody white people into their own bodies. And I think that is one other step into doing this kind of work.
Yeah, Dean Gunning Francis recently said that on our podcast, Encountering Silence, that white supremacy has disembodied the white body. And I very, very much am in agreement with that. And coming from a contemplative lens, I kind of see this meeting place, right, where we go into brewing our creativity, or go into ourselves to know what our truth is in order to speak out. White people use that as an excuse. White people often use that space of silence and contemplation as a means of avoidance, of a means of doing nothing. And that fails not only everyone, including themselves, but it also fails what contemplation is. Author Therese Taylor Stinson says that the wholeness of contemplation includes inward solitude and reflection, and an outward response. to the situations which we find ourselves present and awake. And, along with that, I'll just say that, we all know that art is another way for us to tap into prophetic imagination and for us to go deeper into the sights of beloved community. And Audre Lorde said that I believe all art makes us more powerfully who we wish to become.
My next question is for Kerry, but I'd be curious for others to chime in as well. Kerry, with the title of your book and sort of with the framework of your book, you're imagining a white person who's resistant to the idea of being a racist. As I was reading the book, I found your case very persuasive, but I found myself almost worrying in the other direction. Like, what happens if I'm so convinced that I'm so deep in the mire of structural racism, structural sin, as we might say, that I become cynical or complacent, or why bother? There's nothing I can do to get myself out of it if things are this bad off. How might you respond to someone who believes what you're saying but has that kind of despair or cynicism response?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and I think that to Cassidy's point again, like that becomes an excuse, right? To say, oh, I can't make a change, but we can make a change. There's a few things that I say to that. First is that I do think that sense of overwhelm is to be expected as part of that grief and lament that I say white people need to go through. That's part of it. It's this utter despair that this system is so big and so complicated that I don't know how I can change it aside from being nice to the Black people in my life, right? Which is a cop-out in a lot of ways, and not entirely true. And it's also true. It is big and horrible and overwhelming, and you alone are not going to fix it, right? I alone am not going to fix it. But when we understand that it's not just an individual system, it's a collective system, and we start to understand the way our individual identity plays a role in the collective and in the systemic, that's when we can begin to subvert it and to dismantle it. And so the example that I always give is, let's say you're somebody who's doing this work and you decide to go into Twitter land or, a Facebook frenzy, right? And you're having these conversations with people who are just committed to misunderstanding you. And this happens to me often. And people will say, well, why do you keep having those conversations? And I say, I do it for the people who are watching. And because what happens if one of the people that is watching is a judge in a juvenile court? And she is white, and she is now begins the process of her own racial awakening and begins to practice agency over her inherent biases and her white pseudosupremacy that is embedded in her. And because of that work, she now starts to make different choices in her sentencing. Now, massive amounts of lives are going to be positively impacted in a way that maybe not a lot of people are going to know about, but something's going to be changing, and that's a chip in the system, right? Until we can get to the point where we can burn it all down and start from scratch, right? Which is really what needs to happen. But I know that's going to freak everybody out, but that's okay. People can be freaked out. But we need to subvert the system, and it's going to take individuals working within the system, within whatever sphere of influence they are in, to do that work. So that's the example that I give to that.
Excellent.
I think what I would just say real quickly is that, yeah, Kerry's book is not for everyone. Kerry is not for everyone. it is confrontational. I'm not for everyone. Mason isn't for everyone. Rob isn't for everyone. It is confrontational, and it's for white people that aren't ready for it. Okay. But if you are ready for it and you're a white person, then do the work, eat it up. And as Kerry's book even says, this work will involve ruined family dinners and tense conversations with coworkers. It will be lost friendships and online arguments. But we have to be willing to invest in that, right? We have to be willing to invest in those conversations. We have to hold that tension of the urgency of now, the fierce urgency of now, and the fact that there's no time for talk when men are suffering, James Cone. But we also have to be willing to understand that we have a really big role in bringing some of the slower people along, those hard conversations at home, those ruined family Thanksgivings. That's on us, white people, I mean, we have to go there while also holding the tension of the urgency.
We just got a call from Kerry's publisher, and they want us to specify the book's not for everyone, but everyone should go buy it.
That's my endorsement. It's a great book. You know what I mean, Kerry.
We totally know what you mean.
We've had a couple of questions come in, and I think some of this is a good segue. It might be a characteristically white gesture in the negative sense to always stay at the level of discourse, and we're just going to get our ideas right. And even though we've talked about the relationship between imagination and language and action, we're in a moment now where the church, I think, is being pushed to think very concretely about actual policies on the ground. So thinking about things like reparations, for instance, I wonder if from your perspective, how should the church go about thinking about something as concrete and direct and controversial as reparations?
Mm-hmm. I'll just be honest. One of the things that pisses me off the most is when I see a church's cop out and say, I don't want to get involved in politics. I call total BS on that. First of all, read the Bible. Okay, but it just, it makes me, I get so furious, right? And I understand, I say that understanding that, that pastors have real concerns about how they're going to pay staffs and how they're going to, keep the doors open. I get all of that. And I still say that we cannot take a middle ground when it comes to actual bodies being harmed. And we have to seek out justice. And one of the most practical in this realm ways that we can seek out justice is a call for actual real monetary reparations. And I don't want to hear about how it's not possible. I don't want to hear about all I'm done. I have no more patience for that. It's time for this country and for the church specifically to lead the call for reparations. And okay, I'll be quiet because I could talk about that for a really long time, but it's imperative. It's imperative.
I first want to talk about how reparations is a step towards reconciliation. I think white people very often want to jump to, well, let's just reconcile our relationship with Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And it's just not simply possible to truly reconcile one's relationship with oppressed groups of people without having some form of reparations. Reverend Lenny Duncan, who is a Lutheran pastor, has this really great section in his recent book called Dear Church, where he talks about in order to get to reconciliation, white people first have to repent and then have to do the reparations. Mm-hmm. And there's so many different ways to do reparations. There's lots of things you can find online how to do that. Certainly there's lots of ways that the church can, but even on an individual level, there are many ways in which you can redistribute your resources to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And one of the ways in which you can do that is finding Black-owned businesses and supporting them. I think about lots of the places that surround me in my neighborhood are often owned by immigrants. They're often owned by Black folks. And so one of my things that I love to do then is to go to those restaurants, to go to those businesses. And that's one way in which my money can be redistributed from my own white self to people who have historically been very disenfranchised, especially when it comes to money. So I think that's even just a very simple thing. Just go, instead of a franchise that's probably owned by a white owner, go to your black store down the street, or a immigrant-owned restaurant. So I think those are very just simple, practical ways of doing that.
As an example, just quickly, before I'm sure Cassie has something brilliant to say, instead of going to Amazon to buy a book, go to Semicolon, which is a Black-owned bookstore in Chicago. Just putting that out there. So.
Yes, and I echo you guys, everything my colleagues here said on reparations, and also want to add to that, as I'm sure we all agree, bad theology kills people, and we have whitewashed the crap out of theology. Mm-hmm. So many theologies are so whitewashed. And this is also existent in our God images. Take down your white Jesus. He goes, get him out of there. it makes no sense. Not only is it false and perpetuating false truth, but it's also offering something that's, perpetuating white supremacy. Mm-hmm. So it's just, I think it's important to recognize all the different layers of where reparations fits. It is, and it's unbelievable how big even the seemingly small things are, because those are things we can do now. You can walk in your church today and take down the white Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I think that it begins with steps like that.
I think that actually was where I wanted my next question to go. We're having this conversation on the basis of, thinking about different theologies that can be liberative, critical race theory, those sorts of things. But all of you also work in context with folks who haven't had the benefit of an excellent CTS education, haven't had training in some of these things. Cassidy, you talked about some initial steps for starting, but what are some other ways that you found that have been effective with folks who have good intentions, but just aren't swimming in these waters in terms of having this at the forefront of their consciousness? What works to start the conversation?
I think that's a really good question. And I think that this is one of the places where white people need to make an investment of time and energy in really understanding the beast of racism and how it operates in the world, and how embedded and entwined all of the different individual institutions are to create this thing called systemic racism and how it operates. Because when you understand that, then what happens is when you engage in that Facebook conversation or the dinner table talk, right, you can attack narratives rather than people. And I think that that's really important. Because that's what's happening is people are regurgitating narratives that they get from headlines, right, or from a meme, and they don't really fully understand because they're not investing in the research and the work. And so those of us who say we care about this are going to do the work to really understand how the justice system and the education system and systemic poverty are all in bed together to perpetuate white pseudosupremacy and racism. And we'll be able to unpack the narratives that people try to throw at us by throwing a meme up on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And we'll be able to really untangle that for them and help them start thinking about the paradigm in a different way. And I think that that's the work that we can do. Some of the work that we can do is really doing the investment in our own educations around systemic racism. Mm-hmm.
I think one thing I would say is that the worst thing you can do if you don't know where to begin is to not begin. Mm. So many of us, to this day, every day I worry about making a mistake, and I make mistakes all the time, but we have to start the work. There is so much work for us to do, and we have to begin having these conversations. My church at First Congregational in Indianapolis, we started a book club, and we're reading Austin Channing Brown's I'm Still Here, and we're having conversations and breaking out into small groups and having deeper conversations about our own stories alongside Austin's stories, and navigating space, because again, we're all a part of helping bring the collective forward. No matter where we are in this journey, we have to help each other. White people have to work with white people to bring us all there.
I think to in addition to all of that, which are all great recommendations, we talk about white supremacy and racism being structural, and I think that's all important. We need to talk about it in those ways. But white supremacy and racism doesn't just exist in structures; they also exist in our body. And we've talked a little bit about this already. But kind of the first step that people can do is start with their own body. Start by recognizing the ways in which white supremacy exists within your own white body. And so, for example, when your racist uncle says a thing during Thanksgiving, notice what your body feels. Just by simply noticing how your body feels and reacts to a situation like that is a really important step for us to start dismantling the white supremacy that even exists within our bodies, not just the structures that exist in our society.
I want to just say something really quick to that, because we've talked about white embodiment, and I think to Mason's point is really brilliant. And the point that I want to make is that white bodies are inherently safer in the world than Black and Indigenous people of color's bodies are, right? And we need to recognize that, so that when Mason says something like we need to start taking risks with our bodies by placing our bodies between rubber bullets and protesters, right? We can do that, understanding that while it's still a risk, it's less risky for us to do that than it is for a Black person to do that. And there was a video, I wish I could find it, but it demonstrated this so well. And it was a planned protest in a courtroom by a group. I don't remember the specifics, but the visuals were really powerful, because they decided that they were going to have a Black man stand on the table and start speaking during this courtroom proceeding, and he would be surrounded by his colleagues who were all white. And as the police officers started to attempt to get him down, all the white people had to do was move and block their way between, and put their body between the officer and the Black man. And those white bodies stayed untouched and safe. And that never would have happened if those bodies had been Black, right? And so that was such a powerful visual for me to see that. And so I just want to make that point, that when we talk about white embodiment, we have to understand that we are walking around in bodies that are inherently safer in the world. And we enjoy a privilege of safety that Black bodies simply do not.
And furthermore, they wouldn't be able to do something like that where they surround this Black man had they not gone through a lot of training and preparation in their own white embodiment, where they start to recognize the ways in which white supremacy manifests within their own bodies. And by working and processing through that, they get to a point where they're willing to step in like that, and their body naturally reacts like that, because they have built this habit. And so I think about this all the time when I will go around the Twin Cities and I see a Black man stopped by the police. My immediate reaction should be, let me assess the situation, and do I need to intervene? That should be my body's natural reaction in a situation like that, because I will need to have gone through all that processing of how white supremacy exists within my body. And as I process it, I'll be able to be more prepared for situations like that.
Kerry, my next question has to do with something that you talk about in your book, but I think it relates to several things that we've been speaking on. How can white people do this work in a way that is genuinely about solidarity and allyship, rather than replicating the dynamics of the white savior complex?
That's imperative as well. So the way that I see that, first of all, I have to give credit to the many Black people who have invested in me to teach me this stuff, whether that's in my interpersonal relationships and they know who they are, or whether that is, people like Austin Channing Brown and the writers that have done this work, because I've learned so much from them. And I think first and foremost, we need to be listening and submitting to Black leadership and voices of color so that we can learn from them. One of the things that I think is really important also is that white people tend, because we have this white savior thing going on, and, that good old Protestant work ethic and, capitalism and this perfectionism, especially white women, we are so afraid of making mistakes. And we're like, just tell me what to do to not be racist anymore. And I'll do it, and be done. Right. I want to check the box, press the button, and be done. And that's not how it's going to be. This is going to be something that we're going to unpack for the rest of our lives. It's sort of like being an addict and in recovery. Right. And we can look back and we can sponsor other people as they begin their journeys, but we are always going to be in recovery. So understanding that, first of all, also understanding that at any given time, the best way to be anti-racist is going to be contextual. And that means engaging with the people of color in the room. I don't know if I want to give her credit, but I'll go ahead and give her credit. I don't know if she's going to like that I gave her credit, but Nicole Barnes one time said to me that if all of the white people in the room are comfortable, chances are the Black people are not. And that was something that really stuck out to me. And I've tried to remember that. But because our work as anti-racists will always be contextual depending on who's in the room. And sometimes that means being an anti-racist will mean that we are standing up and using our voice and saying something when it's scary, so that the Black and Indigenous and people of color in the room don't have to do that labor. And other times it's going to be standing behind them and submitting to their leadership. And it's not going to be the same every time, right? And so it's a matter of understanding it's going to be messy and contextual, and submitting to the leadership of Black people and people of color that can really, and submitting to that leadership that's really going to make a huge difference.
I think the only thing I would add to that is, not only is there a danger in Rob, what you mentioned, in this white savior complex, but also there's a danger in this becoming a performative thing, this becoming a performative platform, as I mentioned in the opening. And case in point, our society is so ingrained in white pseudosupremacy that we gave a white supremacist a performative platform to denounce white supremacy, to only know that he would just uplift it. Then all us good white people ran to our social medias to denounce white supremacy. Now, I think social media can be used as a tool, and I think it's great, and that makes sense. But if we're not living that denouncing, if we're not living into that every single day, then that's just BS. That's baloney.
Mm-hmm.
Mason, did you have a comment?
Nope. Everything that was said was just absolutely brilliant.
I would love to say something about the performative nature of it, and talk a little bit about the difference between So a perfect example of the performative nature of quote anti-racism work is when those politicians decide to wrap themselves in cloths and kneel in some political, Capitol building or wherever they knelt. That's totally performative because they had everything to gain and nothing to lose, right? So like that was something that it made me want to vomit. Somebody pointed out on Facebook, they were critical of brands like Uncle Ben's changing their logos or their names, and in response to racism, and they said that was performative. And if those companies really cared about Black bodies, then what they would be doing is changing the formulas of their very unhealthy syrup and I think it was Aunt Jemima, that kind of stuff. They would be changing the formulas if they really cared about Black bodies. And I was like, no, I mean, yeah, they can do that. That's great. But the removal of those logos and of those brands is actually not a performative move. It's a very important move because those brands have perpetuated the white consumption of Black bodies for our own comfort and nurturance for century, or I don't know how long, for a very long time, right? And so it was not, the removal of those brands was not just a performative nature. Sure, was it performative? Did it get something for those brands good PR? Yeah, absolutely it did. But at the same time, it was an important step in us as a collective saying we are no longer going to perform the consumption of Black bodies for white pleasure. So I think there's a difference, and I think it's really important to recognize that.
Excellent. And that speaks, doesn't it, to the importance. We've had comments from Facebook. There are these very public gestures. There are these large optics. But isn't it the case that so much of this work is, in a sense, hidden, is much more behind the scenes? Has that been your experience?
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's in your interpersonal relationships. And most of all, it's in your own self, I think. I think the work has to be done in your own embodiment, in your own psyche, first and foremost.
So we're coming up on time, and any number of these topics we could spend hours and hours on. I wonder if, by way of conclusion, I'd like to ask each of you, let's say in 60 seconds or less, we can talk all day about the failures of the church, in particular the white church, around some of these issues. But my question to you is, what does good theology, what does the Christian gospel bring to this work? Mm-hmm. Why bring theology into this conversation? And what inspiration do you find when you think about these things from the perspective of theology and what the church can be? Cassidy, could we start with you?
Sure. Yeah. So what does good theology bring? I mean, I think that good theology brings the truth, and the truth sets us free, right? So I think that when we actually live liberative lives and live lives that offer infinite possibility for ourselves and other people, and that's the tomb of Christ. That's the place of infinite possibility. So I think when we live lives that recognize that in ourselves and everyone, that's the good news. That's the good news, that there's space for all, there's room for all at the table, and that there's no hierarchy, no domination. Mm-hmm. And where there's domination, there's not love, as Bell Hooks says. So if we really want the love of Christ to prevail, then we have to let go of all those dominative and hierarchical views.
That's beautiful. Mason, any thoughts?
Yeah, I first off want to say that I think the best way to subvert and confront bad theology is to have good theology. And so I think one of the ways in which Christianity, or one of the theologies that Christianity has to offer to this kind of conversation is a theology that Luther started or thought of, called Theology of the Cross. And I think it has a lot to say to this conversation, because what Luther talks about in Theology of the Cross is that the way in which we know who God is, the place in which we know who God is in the cross. In this moment where Christ is killed by the powers that be, by this not a white supremacist culture or society at the time, but a supremacist society that was imperial and destroying many, many people's lives. And Christ died to that very culture. And that's who we know God to be, was a God that died to the powers that be. And so if we as white people, especially white Christians, are to have any sort of role in confronting white supremacy, we must think about the ways in which God actually dies to the very power of something like white supremacy. God is lynched on that tree, like James Cone would talk about, right? And so if we are to have any, if Christianity has anything to offer for how white people are supposed to confront white supremacy, it's that God is the one who actually dies to white supremacy. And we are not to continue to kill that very God that's dying to white supremacy over and over. And so we must subvert, we must confront, we must resist our own white supremacy.
Fantastic. Kerry?
So my short answer is the womanists will save the world. We should just give it over to them. Just listen to them. Let them handle it. We'll be fine. But I'm totally down with everything that Mason was just saying. And I also want to move forward into resurrection, right? Because I think that's where, that's what I imagine God to be. Is God is theology needs to be life-giving, not death-dealing. And I think so much bad theology is death dealing to people. And it is not Genesis. It is not creativity. It is not life-giving. And I think that's a really good way to determine whether you have a good or a bad theology. Is this life-giving to all? Does it create shalom? Does it offer the shalom of God to all creation? Because if not, then it's death dealing to someone, and it needs to be interrogated and dismantled.
Well, this has been a very rich conversation. The work is long. It doesn't get solved in an afternoon. It doesn't get solved in a lifetime, but it's very good work to be about. And if you've been watching and you'd like to learn more, you can certainly read Kerry's book, Cassidy's films, Mason's podcasts. You can also go to Christian Theological Seminary's website, www.cts.edu, and find out more about what the seminary is about and how we try to live into these values. I want to thank you three, and thanks to all of you who have engaged with us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.